Right. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. And a big welcome to all of you for this book launch. We've been looking forward to it for a long time, on transforming development and education from coloniality to rethinking, reframing and reimagining possibilities. It's a long title, but it very conveniently frames the conversation we'll be having here. And we have three sessions that focus on each of those: rethinking, reframing, and reimagining. So just to go through, that's me, by the way. I'm Hugh McLean, Senior Advisor to NORRAG, and it's a great honor to be chairing this. Right, so our agenda, as I said, there will be, after the presentation by Moira Fahl from NORRAG, there will be three panels, and the writers of those chapters within each panel are here. They'll be on the panel. You'll be able to ask them questions. And we will do the questions after each of the inputs. The inputs are on video. It also saves time because I think there are 3 or 4 videos for each panel. And the panelists will be presenting their chapter in the video. And then they'll be available for your questions. So as the video comes up, please feel free to add a question. There are no questions yet, which is good, but I expect them to start flying in as soon as we start. Then just before we go, I think one word about the NORRAG Senior Fellows. The thing about this book and the presenters is that they're all part of the NORRAG Senior Fellows program. I think you'll see from the wide range of expertise and regions represented, the strength of the NORRAG network in the Global South, across the Global South, and the quality of these senior fellows. And I think, as you'll see from the presentation today, I think is a fabulous way of turning the policy environment on its head. Global South has a tremendous amount to offer to the policy discourse, particularly in this particularly troubled time we are now, where we see titanic geopolitical clashes all over the world, at which the Global South will be receiving the fallout, even if it's not necessarily anything of our making. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the NORRAG Fellows. You'll have a chance to ask them questions. Yes, that's it, I think. So let me then hand over to Moira Fahl. Moira Fahl is a fellow Southern African, so it's a Southern African. I'm South African as well, so it's a Southern African takeover just for the session of the input. Moira Fahl is also director of NORRAG, senior lecturer at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and an alumna of Cambridge and Oxford, I think, for her sins. Moira, thank you. Do go ahead with your input.
Thank you so much, Hugh. I really appreciate your chairing us and bringing us here today. Before we get into the book, just a few words about NORRAG itself. In terms of what it is that we seek to do, what it is that we do and what we seek to influence, our first and most important area of strategic activity is to surface underrepresented knowledge. And that can be from underrepresented experts and also about underrepresented topics and regions and questions. And certainly the work that we are looking at today is an issue that is very much requires more representation in terms of the questions and also the answers that our senior fellows are bringing to this issue. Then we also broker policy dialogue. We also co-produce knowledge and we share capacity. And all of those of our strategic activities are done in order to help our stakeholders to be able to access knowledge, particularly, as I said, underrepresented knowledge on underrepresented questions, to know and therefore to act, and also to be able to amplify that knowledge. Then also these are the strategic themes in which we work. The event today falls into the innovations and disruptions theme that we work on. And as I'm sure most of all of you know, we are a network serving an international community. You're very welcome to join the network. There's a QR code on the screen, and the link will be dropped into the chat as well. And this initiative that we're very proud of is the South Also Knows, a network for experts, and it's also a searchable database to make sure that nobody can say again that they can't find the experts that they're looking for. So on to this book, which I am extremely proud to present to you today with our senior fellows, and thank you so much to our senior fellows for their sterling contributions to this edited book. In NORRAG, we always produce edited works in order to make sure that we are showing a range of perspectives, and in this case, we are doing the same. Now, excuse me, there's a lot of extremely useful work on transforming education, so that education might move away from being a site of perpetuating injustices and perpetuating colonial world order. And those injustices, whether it's about ethnicities, genders, languages, poverty, both absolute and relative poverty, and this is in the global south and also in the global north, to rather being a site of transformation for more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development, and also more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable lives and living. What this book contributes to that important conversation is to show how, in order to transform education, we must also interrogate development as it has been practiced for the past 70 years, and also the philosophical and practical foundations on which that development rests. This book is not about territorial decolonization, which historically has obviously existed and has now been greatly reduced. That said, on the 140th anniversary of the Berlin Conference of the Scramble for Africa, we see more land grabs resurgent in the past decade in new and in old forms. But this book is not specifically about that, nor is it about a Western agenda being imposed on global South realities. Quite the contrary. Our analysis is in fact representative of and underpinned by decades of post-colonial analysis from and by global South experts and also other minoritized experts worldwide. Nor is this book about harking back to some idealized but incorrect notions of a pre-colonial Eden that had no social or environmental problems. And certainly, it is not about giving ourselves and our leaders excuses to perpetuate inequalities domestically, giving ourselves and our leaders excuses not to do better. We can and should demand when and where we can that they do better, and interrogate these inequalities and injustices in the world, both between countries as well as within them, including epistemic injustices, and there are several contributions in the book on that latter point, and also the planetary emergencies that the current model of development has thrust upon us. So I've said what the book isn't. What is it then? First of all, the book analyzes coloniality, and we define, along with many other scholars, coloniality. We define this as the ongoing effects of colonization, because the legacy of colonization persists in development and also in education systems, policy, funding, and research. So that legacy of colonization, these effects of colonialism, matter. They continue to shape all aspects of our social order. They also try to limit us, to tell us there is only one way to know, one way to be, one way to do. We're not offering here a historical tract, but challenging the effects of colonialism in the here and now, and taking those analyses as a springboard to inform what we might do to recognize the limits that are trying to be imposed, to challenge those limits, and also to break free of those limits. First, a few words on the ideas underpinning this post-World War II development notions. These come from the European Enlightenment, centuries old, in one geographical territory, given form in this philosophical term, modernity. And as I said before, modernity tells us that there is one way to be, know, and do. There is one way in which we can know. Science and philosophy are not European inventions, however. Progress also is not only what comes from European modernity. And also this presumption that what is produced in the global north is placeless and universal is certainly not what is useful if we are to break free of these notions. These notions are perpetuated through relations of dominance and control. And this impacts intrinsically what is seen as being good and useful. Good education, what curricular pedagogy and assessment can be used. Are they liberatory, or indeed are they actually perpetuating? As a child in Zimbabwe, and before that in minority rule Rhodesia, I was taught that Great Zimbabwe could not possibly have been built by Zimbabweans. I was taught that maybe Egyptians came and built it, maybe Mayans came across the ocean and built it, and I was even taught in a history class that maybe Atlanteans came to build Great Zimbabwe. Any explanation that would allow the powers to actually say that it was not Zimbabweans who did that. This is the power of curriculum. It also impacts what is seen as being good evidence for education, this idea that research from the global north is placeless and universal, as opposed to very much localized and context-driven. It also makes us think that certain management practices are good and others are not. New public management, for example, results-based financing, data and datification, and all of the implications of that for our children, teachers, schools. And then also affects so many other policy areas that affect education, security, peace and war, tax and illicit financial flows to offshore schemes that were set up in post-colonial times and now limit both domestic and international financing for education. Viewing the economy and what is good for the economy as growth only, the only thing in nature that has unlimited growth is cancer. Why should we think that economic growth is always good? And also telling us that education must serve economic purposes alone. Of course it does that, but we cannot ignore, and we should not ignore, all of the other purposes that education can serve. So the challenge in this book is to ask what other models are available. There will be few surprises in our analyses for those who have been examining the injustices inherent to the system, to those in the majority world, and here I'm talking about the majority world in the global north as well as the global south, those who have suffered most and continue to suffer, and who identified the problem first and challenged and continue to challenge the very system that perpetuates it. In addition to these crucial analyses, we also offer some important ways forward that will be all the more important as we navigate current challenges globally: the rise of authoritarianism, declining trust in government, increasing wealth and increasing inequality at the same time, climate and other environmental crises, geopolitical tensions and conflicts. These are some of the ideas that our senior fellows offer us in this book. In addition to addressing the multiple crises that the world faces, the contributors to this book offer us ways out of what could be a simultaneous crisis of imagination. Descriptive imagination asks us, all of us, to put ourselves in others' shoes, to unlearn in order to be able to learn and relearn from others. There's a challenging imagination asking, what is it that needs to be stopped or left behind? We suggest that one-way only thinking needs to be left behind. Relations of domination need to be left behind. Economic growth above all, again. Ideas of charity rather than justice. Micro practices as well as macro. Thinking through ethics and healing and repair. And finally, creative imagination to think through what futures do we want and what can we do in healing, ethical, reparative ways to move towards the development we want, not that which is imposed upon us. And that means moving towards more just and sustainable futures for all. Thank you all for being here today. Back to you, Hugh.
Thank you so much, Moira. We're going to go straight on to the videos for the next session. So they'll be part of our first panel, and you'll be able to meet them all, I think. Most of them are here, but the session, there'll be 3 videos that will run into one another. I think we're starting with one from Moira as well. But the first chapter on unlearning development, written by Vete Silova, Hikaru Komatsu, and Jeremy Rapley. The second chapter will be Radhika Gorur and Minoli Wijatunga on decolonizing education data theories and prospects. And Crane Sodin will talk about sustaining disruptive development possibilities in the university at the end, and then you'll be able to ask them about that. So apologies about the introductions. There is a lot that each of these colleagues has done. Please have a look at their biographies on the NORRAG website. Thanks very much. Do go ahead, Camille, with the video.
Hello, my name is Vete Silova, and I'm excited to share a chapter I co-wrote with my brilliant friends and colleagues, Jeremy Rapley and Hikaru Komatsu. Our chapter is called Unlearning Development, Education in the Era of Planetary Emergency, and it appears in NORRAG's book on transforming development and education, from coloniality to rethinking, reframing, and reimagining possibilities. In our chapter, we ask a difficult but urgent question: what if the very concept of development is not the solution but part of the crisis itself? In a world more educated than ever before, education is often seen as a tool of progress, yet it is also implicated in sustaining the very systems driving ecological and social collapse. Instead of learning more and more of the same, our research calls for unlearning old models and reimagining education as a way to nurture more ecologically just and sustainable planetary futures.
For more than 6 decades, international development has promised progress, yet poverty remains entrenched, inequality widens, and environmental destruction accelerates. This chapter challenges the assumption that development simply needs better policies, improved metrics, or more funding to succeed. Instead, we argue that true transformation requires unlearning the very foundations on which development rests: its modern, colonial hierarchies, its obsession with infinite growth, its reliance on expert-driven solutions, and its underlying belief in individualism and human exceptionalism.
We believe this chapter contributes to a much-needed shift in how we think about education, development, and the future of our planet. Unlearning is not just about critique, it's about making space for new ways of knowing and being that foster interdependence and planetary well-being. So instead of asking how we move forward, let's ask what we need to leave behind. We invite you to read the chapter, sit with these difficult questions, and join us in reimagining education beyond the constraints of development.
Hello, I'm Radhika Gurur, and I'm the author of the chapter Decolonizing Education Data, Theories and Prospects in NORRAG's book Transforming Development in Education, Rethinking, Reframing, and Reimagining Possibilities.
Hello, I am Minoli Vijaytunga, the co-author. This chapter examines the phenomenon of data colonialism with relation to education. Data are deeply political instruments that claim to make populations visible, measurable, and governable. Historically, governments and international organizations controlled large-scale data generation. However, recent digitization has enabled vast amounts of data to be produced cheaply, and private corporations as well as national and international organizations now have more data and a larger variety of data than ever before.
The extraction and commodification of data, the dominance of Western epistemologies in data practices, and the entrenchment of historical inequities based on race, gender, and class in datafication have led to theories of data colonialism and digital colonialism. We examine these practices in relation to education. We look at some emerging practices around decolonizing data by indigenous groups, social movements, and social theorists, based on principles of collective ownership and benefit, community rights over access, ethics, and context-sensitive analysis. We argue that more theorization is needed to develop alternative frameworks that invert power dynamics and protect the rights of marginalized people.
Hello, my name is Crane Sodine, and I'm the author of Chapter 3 in NORRAG's book entitled Transforming Development in Education, From Coloniality to Rethinking, Reframing, and Reimagining Possibilities. The title of the chapter is Sustaining Disruptive Development Possibilities in the University, a Conceptual Exploration. The focus of this contribution is on the difficulty of sustaining disruptive intellectual interventions in the modern university. What do I mean by disruptive interventions? Disruptive interventions challenge hegemonic epistemes wherever they may arise and offer possibilities for analyzing problems, social situations, and phenomena in and through alternative ways of seeing. The key message of the chapter is this: against the global backdrop of the persistent fragility of disruptive projects, this article uses Bonnie Honig's ideas of holding environments to explore what the minimal conditions for sustaining disruptive interventions might be. It looks particularly at what I call tending practices of democracy, such as the cultivation of public dialogue, debate, and the establishment of open spaces for forms of engagement and contestation. So I invite you to read the chapter and the wider publication and share your thoughts with us. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Can I ask the panelists to turn their videos on, please, so we can see you? Thanks. Hi, Radhika, and the others as well.
All of you.
Hello, hello. So we do have one question, and I'm hoping that the others are going to come in. But the first question, of course, is a deep and practical one. And the question is submitted by Beata Godenzi. Thank you very much, Beata. How can the current context, the drastic cuts that we see in aid, including education, how will they affect the narrative on decolonialization and education projects and changes going on? and requested by the community. These are bottom-up demands that drive the need for reform. Are we going to get back to a more top-down agenda, to opposite focus on local dynamics with more dictation by OECD actors? So it's from Beata Godenzi, Enfant du Monde. Who would like to take it?
Maybe I can start if colleagues don't mind.
To go ahead.
Thank you so much. I was expecting, of course, this question, especially sitting here in the United States right now and reading a lot of the reflections from some of my colleagues who discuss the current dismantling of USAID in particular as perhaps an opportunity to disrupt the entrenched power structures and that perpetuate dependency and neocolonialism. But I wanted to say that the reality is so much more complex at the same time, because what we see with this dismantling of USAID under the Trump administration is something that aligns very directly with the broad America First agenda, which prioritizes nationalist interests over global cooperation altogether. And this move reinforces a pattern of retreat from international commitments, shifting U.S. away from multilateral engagement and towards isolationist stance that prioritizes supposedly domestic concerns, which are very, very highly contested themselves and which are, in fact, disproportionately harming vulnerable populations, both at home and abroad. And you probably have seen already that on March 7th, the U.S. Minister Counselor to ECOSOC in the UN, Edward Hartney, denounced the Agenda 2030 and rejected SDGs, basically arguing that these are inconsistent with U.S. sovereignty and have adverse effects on the rights of the interest of Americans, and basically saying that that the U.S. administration has set clear, I'm quoting right now, an overdue course correction on gender and climate ideology, which he said pervade SDGs. So it's very, very disturbing patterns that we see. And in fact, what we have argued in our chapter about unlearning development, what we see, including unlearning hierarchies or unlearning the dependencies, we see all of this reinforced 100 or million times more right now, but only in the interests of the United States. And of course, you all have seen it, play already in the case of Ukraine, where we also see the very transactional development examples that are already emerging, and it's very disturbing as well. Basically, the demanding, right, that we have access to rare minerals and energy resources in Ukraine in exchange for military support and political solidarity with Ukraine. So it's very, very disturbing. And we also see this opening space for rising private sector and military-driven development, and which prioritize private investments over direct aid, and which potentially could replace USAID programs. So it means that development efforts may be shaped by corporate interests rather than social and economical justice. So just really quickly, I want to say, if we truly want to unlearn development, it would require not just dismantling of traditional aid structures, but also fostering new forms of solidarity, redistributing wealth, supporting the self-determined pathways for development, which we do not necessarily see right now at all. But however, this current trajectory suggests a shift towards isolationism rather than transformation. It reinforces global inequalities rather than addresses them. And by renouncing the SDG agenda, I think the U.S. really has signaled that it's no longer invested in the broader vision of a just and more sustainable world, basically leaving behind a development landscape that risks becoming even more fragmented, even more exploitative, and even more unequal. So this is how it feels in this moment, speaking from the U.S. But I would love to hear what my colleagues are experiencing now and how all of this reverberates globally.
Thanks, Iveta, for letting us know from the view from the roller coaster. I'm going to move right on to the next question, if you don't mind, because we are a bit pressed for the time. It's a question from Jordan Naidu, and it is how can we move from development as a problem to be solved towards a paradigm that genuinely envisions a common world? I think we'll see some of that, Jordan, as we go through this, but I wonder if there's a comment on it now at this point. One that acknowledges diverse epistemologies. Jordan says in histories without reproducing hierarchies. That's exactly what the book is about. But if anyone has a short answer now, please do pop in to answer it. And then just one other thing about the questions. There are one or two practical questions about where to find the book, and that could I ask someone to respond in the webinar chat as to where to get the book and those kinds of practical questions. But for now, who wants to take from the panel Jordan's question? Thanks so much, Iveta.
I'll go quickly, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Crane. Do go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks very much for that question. So we really are looking at very difficult and challenging times. And this is the substance of, and I'm doing a little bit of self-promotion here, my chapter. So my chapter is about disruption and about initiatives around the world that are attempting to speak back to power. And what I'm trying to do in that chapter, and this is my response to you, Jordan, is to be looking at ways in which we can sustain those initiatives, because the direction in which a lot of our politics is going right now is for us to misunderstand the moment and to develop political modalities, practices, which don't deal with the complexity of what we've got in front of us. And so a lot of what we do is issue-based. We come and we raise our voices, but we're unable to develop strategies for, in some ways, what I would call nurturing these alternatives. But the important thing to say to all of you is that these alternatives continue to exist amongst us in small kinds of ways. They're often invisible, but the key thing is how to hold on to that, to those nodes of what I call glimpses of what the future might be, and that's our challenge right now. And we in education, I'd like to say, have a really important role to play in doing that. I really am sympathetic to you folks, Iveta, in the US, where the curriculum at the moment is being, in some ways, gutted, and your options for being able to speak even in classrooms, is being minimized. We elsewhere in the world, must be looking at ways of trying to be in sustainable relationships with people in the US right now. And that's a really important moment for us to confront. Thanks you.
Thanks very much, Crane. I'm going to take one more question before we move on. And then I just want to remind you that even if your question isn't answered in the discussion, I will ask anyone from the panel to respond to you in writing, and we'll have all of that in record, so you'll be able to get that up. So don't despair if we don't get to you. There's a lot to get through. But I did want to pick up a question from Sarah Black, and I think it is a question on all of our minds, and that is the move, Sarah says, from thinking differently to doing differently, if you like. Given that there's a lot of work on rethinking differently, offering alternative perspectives and criticizing hegemonic practice in existence, those of the power are doubling down. So how do we get from here to there? What is the practical question? Any thoughts on that at the moment? How do we get from unlearning to undoing and to redoing? So a quick response on that from anyone else on panel one.
What a tough question, and what an important one. And I was just thinking that since I didn't respond to either of the two questions, maybe I would respond to the next one, but then just my luck that I got this one. Yeah, it's a really, as I said, an important question. But in a way, I feel that
the NORRAG initiative of the South also knows is one of the kind of examples of, I think, where the importance of cataloging what is already happening would play a part in facilitating this shift from just small initiatives that are scattered to a body that is capable of moving things, that is already moving things. In the chapter that Minoli and I wrote, we have cataloged some of the initiatives, particularly frameworks from the Maori community in New Zealand, other indigenous ways of thinking about data, and how those initiatives actually can invert the power dynamics, and how they can how they can put back the control over data and the kind of restore the respect for the communities from whom these data are being developed and taken, and so on. And so I think there are initiatives going on. There are actually communities that are doing things. And in some ways, perhaps this huge disruption that has happened, as damaging as it is going to be for development, would actually force us to rethink this notion of development. That goes actually back to Jordan's question as well. In fact, we spent a lot of time in the beginning through our discussions amongst the fellows about this notion of just rethinking this whole idea of development altogether. And Crane has also commented on that just now as part of his chapter's focus. So I think there are examples, and I think the more examples we are able to put together and put forward, the more it'll inspire other people to think of how this can be done, without minimizing. I'm saying that without minimizing the huge challenge that it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radhika. We are going to move on to the next part now, which is a series of inputs from these wonderful authors about reframing the process of development, so that we can actually think about some idea of collective recuperation, reparations, and reconciliatory justice. The inputs will come from Catherine Adora Hoppers, who wrote a fabulous chapter on looking at systems transformation, Arathi Sriprakash, reparations and the ruins of development, delinking material and epistemic justice, and Caribbean reparations. So we have a very contextual contribution from Nigel Brissett and Tavis Jules, and we'll be looking at the micro fragments of reparation, looking at practices of a community in the Andes, and Veronica Bassini Ketchabor. Sorry, I can't see the last name. Just me open my hold. Yes, thank you. Will be presenting for us. So thanks very much. Do go ahead, Camille, with the video.
Hello. My name is Catherine Odora Hoppers, and I'm the author of Chapter 4, entitled Development Education is a Methodology for Systems Transformation. What does restorative action and cognitive justice represent in this NORRAG book? From encountering the love songs of development to discovering and overcoming the trails of disturbing audios that follow, and to taking an independent stand, a persistent question that has followed me was this: can development ever be educated? How can development as we know it generate a sense of restorative action, a sense of coming home in the lives of citizens of the South, whether they live frivolly or not, whether they have a shoe or not? This article pushes development beyond the current sting and the disturbing audios that lies in its wake into a future-oriented perspective, which brings together an ethical, empowering, and healing practice for all.
on the ground. This chapter draws on a piece of the South African Researchers Initiative in Development Education, funded by the South African Department of Science and Technology, hosted by the University of South Africa, in which this transformative methodology of bringing together the theory and practice of restorative actions that uses indigenous knowledge systems is an approach to opening up the gridlock in epistemology between the West and others was put into practice in the academy for 10 years. It concludes that if development occurs in a plural and ethical manner, restoration and healing will occur. I invite you to read this chapter and the wider publication and share your thoughts accordingly. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Arathi Sriprakash, and I'm the author of the chapter entitled Reparations in the Ruins of Development in NORRAG's book on transforming development in education, from coloniality to rethinking, reframing, and reimagining possibilities. This chapter critically examines the post-war development project and argues that it has failed to address the structural injustices of colonial racial capitalist systems. In fact, in upholding these systems, the development project can be thought of as an injustice itself. The chapter explores what it would involve to radically rethink the future of development through the lens of reparation and reparative redress. A reparative framework compels us to address past and present injustice and work towards anti-oppressive futures. The chapter considers reparative action in terms of material redress, epistemic repair, and reparative pedagogies, reflecting on how such approaches might transform development in education. I hope you find the chapter and the wider book useful in promoting conversations and action about the possibilities of reparative justice in your work.
Hello, my name is Nigel Brissett, and I am the co-author of the chapter Linking Development, Material and Epistemic Justice and Caribbean Reparations in NORRAG's book entitled Transforming Development in Education, from Coloniality to Rethinking, Reframing and Reimagining Possibilities. NORRAG has implored the development community to critically reconsider and reconceptualize development to emphasize more progressive, inclusive and equitable approaches, with reparations playing an important role in this agenda. We take up this challenge and use the Caribbean as our entry point to reflect on the violent making of today's global capitalist modernity project, engage with the logic of reparatory justice, and briefly propose two paths to material and epistemic reparations. We call for the rethinking of Caribbean development through the lens of reparations using two approaches. First, materially, we advocate for a structural overhaul of the global aid system in order to use it to help restore economic wealth that was unjustly extracted from the Caribbean to enrich former colonizing powers, which contributed to the socioeconomic underdevelopment in Caribbean societies. Second, we emphasize the necessity for epistemic reparations. Here, we specifically advocate for the recognition of the right of Caribbean societies to validate their knowledge systems and ways of knowing. This would include Caribbean societies having greater autonomy to shape their educational systems, as well as giving greater value to Caribbean knowledge within and beyond the Caribbean region. We believe that this chapter contributes significantly to how we rethink development and social change, with a greater focus on addressing deep-seated inequities of today, which are fundamentally rooted in the past. Our argument in support of structural overhaul of the global aid system alongside epistemic reparations has both moral and practical foundations. We invite you to read the chapter and the wider publication and share your thoughts. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Veronica Passini-Quechebo, and I'm the co-author alongside Cristina Delgado Ventimiglia of a chapter in NORRAG's book, Transforming Development in Education, from Coloniality to Rethinking, Reframing, and Reimagining Possibilities. The title of our chapter is Microfragmentos of Reparation and Reinvention, Cheche Food Practices with Women and Children. This chapter presents microfragments of reparation and reinvention, which are modest, localized political initiatives confronting the encroachment of capitalist and neo-colonial forces in the highlands of the Ecuadorian Andes. The microfragments we describe emerged from a pedagogical project with Kaniari women and children. Through practices such as growing potatoes, preparing meals together, and introducing children to traditional childhood meals, women and children reshape the conditions of their everyday lives. We argue in the chapter that the seemingly minor moments serve as acts of reinvention, challenging the colonial legacies and tragedies collectively inherited by Kaniari women and children in the modernized Andes. We invite you to read the chapter and the wider publication and share your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Could I ask the contributors to that section, the panelists, to turn their videos on, and welcome all. So we have a number of questions, but I think segueing in from that wonderful question, wonderful input on the moments that matter so much in everyday life. There's a wonderful question from Virginia Gomez, and she says, in Brazil, critical questions are posed in the classroom about stark inequality of our society. Yet students are rarely exposed to curriculum that shows them alternatives or tools to act differently. To act differently, students need to learn different ways of living, ways of being. Competing for jobs is not working for most. The jobs aren't actually there, right, in every situation. What would be a different way of acting today economically in our capitalist world? So who would like to respond to that big question about the heart of it? Do go ahead, Veronica.
Yes, I can say something very briefly. I think that this is a very important question that leads us to the issue of schooling and education. And for the last few years, I am being exposed to different systems and different ways in which education is enacted in Latin America. I really question whether the space for reinvention is formal education. And perhaps we need to rethink how we are trying to find responses and different ways of being, different kinds of curriculum within formal schooling. And we have to remember that formal schooling is based on modern ideas that have created the conditions that we are trying to fight. So I think that we have to look into other ways of organizing communities and creating common worlds that are specific to the conditions in which we live and the situations that we encounter. And perhaps we need to not necessarily think that we can change the world through schooling.
Thanks very much, Veronica. You know, a number of the other questions, there's one from Alison Joyner, one from Jimeno Corzo that asks for practical examples. And I think we had some there from the Andes, but also from the Caribbean. But Alison's question is, you know, about how the ideas, the theory in the book, how these theoretical ideas can be made, how accessible they actually are in practical situations. And so I think it gets down in the end to the real challenges faced by teachers in the everyday world, in the everyday life. So I think that really is the question. It's similar to the one we've looked at. And if there's anyone else, I see Catherine, you're waving. You're either just saying hello or you have a wonderful answer. But do go ahead, Catherine. I'm shooting both and respond to that. And other panelists as well. I think we'll come back to this question. Go ahead,
Yes.
Ma.
Yeah, people think of schooling and the experience of meeting young people and so on. But I met old people in higher education for 10 years. And my methodology for bringing restoration and healing to the higher education sector, I mean, people should watch it because, it makes sense, and it is very important because it is the higher education that shapes what goes into the primary schooling, So in South Africa, under the leadership of the South African Chair in Development Education, which was funded by a parliamentary dispensation and governed by the Ministry of Science and Technology, they created these chairs to advance the frontiers of thinking. Well, I took it up, and it was fun because I gathered the vice chancellors of the universities in South Africa. I gathered thinkers from all over the world in quantum physics, from anthropology of science and philosophy and so on, 40 of them. And I had 26 postgraduate students. And then I had the sages from the 9 provinces of South Africa. So I brought them once a year in my retreats, a paperless retreats. Nobody was obliged to present papers. I don't like the academy in insisting, please write for me papers. No. For 10 years, I assembled these big stakeholders, the thinkers and the students and the sages and so on. We were together for 2 weeks in a year. Now you can think, how will a vice chancellor talk to a sage in front of the students and thinkers from all over the world? You get me? I stop there. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Catherine. Could we, as people have been asking about experience from different regions, colleagues from the Caribbean, would someone care, Tavis or Nigel, would you care to come in with some thoughts on curriculum and transformation in practice?
Sure, I can jump in here. I think one of the things that our chapter is emphasizing is that we understand that the current system is broken and that we can't fix the current system with the current ways that we're thinking of, the current anthropistemological ways of acting, thinking, knowing, and being. And we need to think through what alternatives are. At the end of the day, we're not saying that you need to throw both the proverbial baby and bathwater out. What we are saying is that we need to look for alternatives, and alternatives needs to be thought of in a way that helps us to fundamentally rethink and reshape and ultimately move into a different direction. And so in our chapter, by exploring material and epistemic reparations, we're saying that money is not going to be the only thing that can solve the problems within the Caribbean. we need to fundamentally rethink what that means. And so in focusing on the epistemic nature of reparations, we're arguing that investment in education is but one way to move the conversation a bit forward, but it also means that we seriously need to rethink the system, and we can't help but to keep playing an emphasizing the need to rethink, and that is that it's not just working, and some of the other we keep thinking that what we're doing is working, and that's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and over again. And part of what we're saying is that now is fundamental to do it now. And the last thing I'll say, I think this goes back to the point that Yvette was raising. Maybe we should look at the way in which things are occurring in the US and look and see what lessons we can learn from them. So it's a shame in terms of what is going on with USAID, but it also perhaps allows us to really fundamentally rethink the ways in which we have been giving money to development and the ways in which we're thinking about development, but more importantly, the ways in which we think about how the South should contribute to its own development agenda.
Thanks, Tavis, and how we can unlearn from the US. Arathi, before we move on, I just wanted to the next panel. I wondered if you'd have a quick, like to comment on one of these two.
Yeah, I've been trying to think about how to come in here. I've been actually quite taken by a comment that we received in the chat from a participant who was asking us, how can we talk of all of this reimagining work that we need to do in this kind of very theoretical way when, even the possibility of reimagination is being attacked now, for example, in Palestine with the breaking of the ceasefire and some 400 tragic lives lost in the last 24 hours. And I want to kind of ask us all collectively to think about what this work means in a time of great violence, great human rights abuses, mass atrocities. This is the world that we are currently living in. And I think in the book, many of us try to map out some frameworks of justice. My own chapter focuses on the possibility of reparation and reparative justice. And the thing that I want to sort of highlight to people here today is that framework of justice is specifically building on an idea of a collective recognition of past and present injustices. We need to have a way of collectively recognizing those where we've got it wrong as a global community, thinking about, the great harms that have been visited on specific populations, both either through prior forms of colonialism or current forms of settler colonialism. So I think the reparative framework might offer a kind of a moral and political guidepost for trying to deal with some of our time's most pressing issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Arathi. We're in a world where our reality has a way of intervening, I think, on our thoughts in a very dramatic and direct way. And there's so much we need to deal with when it comes to justice in practice, that I think it's really hard for us to keep our theory disciplined and focused on the real priorities of the day. But this, in a way, is precisely what I think the book is coming at from the perspective of our field. And I'd like us to move on to the last set of video presentations and the last panel, so we can begin to focus our mind on where we take this from here. What are the actual reimaginings that are going to take us forward in what we think, and of course what we do and how we organize. So thanks very much. Okay, yes, I have to introduce. So one or two people we've heard can't make it from this panel. I think there's huge time differences with everyone in different places. But there's a fabulous poem you'll hear, I think it in its entirety, by Vanessa Andriotti. Prachi will be unable to join us, but she writes about epistemic humility, which I think is really important in an age of dominant narratives, and how we need to respond with honesty intellectually if we need to think of a way forward. Wonderful input from Keita Takayama and Teiko Okitsu on how to excavate a good sense. That is a word we need to do. We've got to unbury it from tons of rubble to excavating good sense in international education development and finding a middle way based on the experience of Japan for those of us that are looking at experience at practical ways forward. And then Catherine is here to answer questions, I know, on her wonderfully provocative conclusion to the book on reflections and provocations on decolonizing development and education. So please also do contribute questions. We'll get to them as much as we can. And as I said, if we don't get to them in the discussion, we will do our best to write directly to each of you in the chat. So thank you very much. Go ahead.
Development. Whose idea of forward? A choice made in whose name? For whose benefit? At what costs? At whose expense? Sustainability. Of what? For what? For whom? Decided by whom? Imposed on whom? Education. As continuity? As interruption? For compliance? For transgression? For whose future? On what livable planet? We cannot talk about a sustainable future without the capacity to talk about the painful things that haunt us, from where we have come from where we are at, and from where we are going. We cannot talk about a sustainable future without the capacity to talk about occupied territories, enslaved humans, exploited labor, violated bodies and lands in the name of development. We cannot talk about a sustainable future without the capacity to talk about expropriation and extraction, destitution and dispossession, genocides and ecocides that underwrite what we want to see sustained. We cannot talk about a sustainable future without the capacity to talk about the harms of colonialisms, of imperialisms, of wars and slaveries, of forced migrations and of militarizations happening in the name of progress and prosperity. We cannot talk about a sustainable future without the capacity to talk about how education is used to normalize and naturalize metropolitan consumer individualism, white Western supremacy, paternalism, and saviorism through a harmful single story of civilization as modernization. Climate destabilizations, biodiversity apocalypse, UN term, global mental health crises, obscene wealth disparities, looming economic instabilities, increasing violence, precarity and polarization, the threat of our own premature extinction at our doorsteps. No shit, Sherlock. What policies and cooperation in education and training could be able to prepare us to navigate, let alone change the course, of the present weaving of this likely future?
Hi, my name is Prachi Srivastava, and I'm the author of Chapter 9 entitled, Why is Epistemic Humility Provocative? A Reflexive Story. This is in NORRAG's book on transforming development in education from coloniality to rethinking, reframing, and reimagining possibilities. This chapter is born from my experiences of writing about and presenting the idea of epistemic humility at various high-level international fora, and from the reactions of discomfort and provocation it caused for some. The chapter weaves in and out of storytelling as a form of narrative exposé for theory building. I combine threads of reflexive exercises spanning nearly 4 years to consider a collective, consciously critical question: why is humility, and in particular epistemic humility, provocative? Epistemic humility is the explicit act of acknowledging the limits of knowledge in time and in fact, and further to acknowledge that knowledges are framed by sociopolitical and historical contexts that are legitimized or delegitimized. We cannot know everything, we do not know everything, and what we know is framed by who and what are valued in our societies. I argue that epistemic humility is essential to consciously and critically engaging in a process of collective questioning for epistemic justice. I argue that the hope is in the collective, in we, in us, to demand and enact change, not just for survival, but for just survival. The discomfort and provocation experienced by some cannot be explained by a simple global south, global north divide. It results from positionalities at play. That is, who has individual and/or institutional privilege regarding who, and that these hierarchical dynamics are not static and exist in all societies. I invite you to read the chapter and the wider publication and to share your thoughts.
Hello, my name is Keita Takayama. Along with the Taiko Kitsu, we wrote this chapter called How to Excavate Good Sense in International Educational Development, the Middle Way Approach to the Age of Japan. The chapter is included in NORRAG's new book, Transforming Development in Education from Coloniality to Rethinking, Reframing and Reimagining Possibilities. In this chapter, we have tried to develop a critical reflection on the way we engage in the middle way, that is to pursue both practicality and critical reflexivity in the evaluation research on Japan's latest education export/cooperation strategy called Age of Japan. The chapter is written retrospectively, as the middle way was not part of our regional research plan, but rather emerged through a series of post-research discussion and reflection between us. The chapter presents this middle way as one possible strategy to narrow the persistent gap between policy practitioners and critical policy researchers. In retrospect, there was a certain shift in our research purpose, as well as in our disposition over the course of interview work. It was a shift from trying to expose Egypt's unethicality and challenging its legitimacy towards excavating their good sense, using it as a potential resource for our constructive feedback to policy actors. This shift required us to abandon our usual stance as a critical researcher, that is to take a moral high ground over the Egypt actors, so we can judge and condemn them. Instead, we came to terms with and eventually embraced the assumption that anyone who involved in international education development would experience a degree of moral ethical dilemma, though these might not be brought to their consciousness in the first place. Seen from this perspective, our job as a researcher became to assist them to articulate their often fleeting sense of discombobulation and hesitation. And this shift in our research orientation was brought to a consciousness only after we revisited the interview data and further reflected upon the whole research process while writing up the chapter. We sincerely hope that our chapter will invite those who research international education development to reconceptualize critical social research in the field of comparative international education. And we hope that you will enjoy the chapter. Thanks for listening.
Hello, my name is Catherine Moeller. I am the author of the concluding chapter entitled Reflections and Provocations on Decolonizing Development and Education in NORRAG's book on Transforming Development and Education from Coloniality to Rethinking, Reframing, and Reimagining Possibilities. My reflection builds on my colleagues' chapters to illuminate how the existing hegemonic structures of education and international development distort our collective possibilities for shared thriving and freedom, while also creating a terrain of struggle for more just visions of the world and opportunities for repair. The chapter uses two problem spaces I have studied over the last decade: the political economy of global investment in girls' education and the financing of EdTech, to illuminate the contradictions, harms, and possibilities of practices and policies in the field. I first explore the ontological and epistemological violence at the heart of education development. These forms of violence continue to structure but never determine the present and extend into the future, particularly as they become embedded within techno-capitalism's data and algorithmic structures, with the expanding role of EdTech in schooling, higher education, and society. This brings us to the second problem, that the material relations of coloniality, with its infrastructures of extraction, its financing and debt structures, its labor regimes, and systems of discipline that have, in large part, not only been built on structures of enslavement and other forms of labor, social, and political economic control, but deepened in the modern capitalist system as new frontiers of capitalist growth absorb humans, ecologies, cultures, and knowledge forms within a system that has to expand and secure its hegemony in order to survive. I hope this chapter contributes to thinking about our current historical moment and the betrayals it requires of us as scholars, practitioners, and activists across different yet interrelated sites of struggle.
Thank you so much for that. It was wonderful. You know, in 1986, you might remember a wonderful book by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Decolonizing the Mind. And, you know, a lot of the questions are about where do we go and what do we do from here? And I think education always reminds us that the start is with the decolonizing minds, our own, and continually. It's a continual process, but also in the way we engage in education and creating. And I think from this last session, we've seen a lot of the talk about examples in practice, but also I think part of our reality is that our examples are in struggle, not so much in the perfected examples or perfected practice that we've seen, and we have to build on the legacies of struggle as well. So I'd just like us to reflect on these questions. I think they've come up. George Sebastian's question also raises that, you know, how can researchers, CSOs, people begin to do things in a different way? But if we can start thinking about practical ways forward in this immensely challenging and quite tragic and terrifying world where we have to take one step at a time, I'd be really grateful for thoughtful and inspiring words from. And Catherine, I think the focus is on you, given that you're the only one here from that last panel, but I would also invite others to come in as well. And we're only going to spend 5 minutes, so we have time to do a decent tie-up from 1:20 my time. Okay, go ahead.
What do you want me to do?
Well, there's a question
sorry, Catherine Muller. Catherine.
Sorry, Catherine. Yeah. Sorry, Catherine.
Catherine, if you have thoughts, please jump in.
Catherine's always ready to jump in, but let's hear from Catherine Muller. Thanks, Moira, for reminding us. Catherine Muller, to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hugh. So I guess I give a little discussion about my conclusion. Just, you know, I kind of try to put forward a set of ways of thinking about rethinking, repairing, reprioritizing, and resisting that really hopefully sums up the ideas of all the authors in the chapter. And I think, you know, we have to be simultaneously doing all of those from our different situated positionalities. And so I think, you know, any thought on how we move forward has to be attentive to, you know, our own bodies and how we are situated, you know, geopolitically. I think thinking about the nations where we're situated geopolitically, and kind of how we move together, you know, in solidarity across really large relations of difference, which, you know, at moments seem very difficult to bridge. And I think, you know, so kind of with epistemic humility, as Prachi says, I don't have, you know, the kind of answers to that. But yeah, I think if people have very specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. Or
Thanks, Catherine. You know, Michael Gibbons has been asking something in different polite ways all the way through, and it's about what NORRAG does, I think, in response to this. I mean, are there think tanks of NORRAG in the Global South? He asks at one point. So I think there is a question for NORRAG, as there is for every organization, and every way, in fact, in which progressive actors from the Global South with a different perspective on the upside down world we get from the top. So I think there are very hard questions all of us have to ask ourselves at this time. But Jordan Naidu sums up, I think, in his question very helpfully as well. How can we ensure that these reimaginings translate into actionable and lasting change? And that's, of course, the question we're left with, but it's a persisting one. Any thoughts on this before we do more? I don't know if you have anything else, Catherine, or if one of the others do want to pop in, please let me know.
Thank you for that question, Jordan. I mean, I don't think we can ensure that, right? I think that has to be created and co-constructed through struggle, right? I don't think so. I think it requires the kind of absolute reimagining and thinking from different spaces in a collaborative way. It also requires kind of betrayals, right, of the existing geopolitical structure and kind of the ontologies that construct that, the kind of ways of knowing, the epistemologies that construct that and construct the curriculum that we all teach at our various universities, that are in our primary and secondary schools that people have talked about, and it's also, I think we need to think about the kind of material structures that determine where we're moving and kind of how do we move against those at a moment when there are really, really high stakes.
Thank you very much, Catherine. We are going to move on now. Thank you very much, all of you. In closing remark is Viam Bhagapuna says that how do we deal with all of this with colonialism that we've been fighting for generations? I think we are seeing a time where the colonial North is weaker than it's ever been. And we're seeing very vicious kicks from a system that is declining. But I am going to hand over right now to Changwon Bayek, who will close with some wonderfully positive and constructive thoughts and some input on NORRAG for us and what we do next. So Changwon, thank you. You have the floor for the next 9 minutes or so. Thank you very much, Chan.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to share the closing remarks for the launch of this very timely volume. Just based on all the questions and comments shared in the chat box and the Q&A, I could feel the enthusiasm and interest about this very important topic and your thorough engagement and hard work on this. So with that, I would like to congratulate and thank the editor and the contributors for this ambitious and necessary work. To me, this book reads more than an academic work. It is a political, ethical, and imaginative act because it challenges the taken for granted foundations of development and education and questions what many people have long assumed to be neutral and necessary. Because too often in the field, development is discussed as an unquestioned good, something to be measured, implemented, and then scaled. But I would say this book reminds us to question development and education for whom, by whom, and at what cost. So as discussed in this book, education systems can move from reproducing hierarchies to nurturing planetary consciousness and relational ethics. Also, the discussions around data and epistemology also raise critical questions about who gets to count, what gets counted, and how knowledge systems are shaped by colonial legacies. So the contributions demonstrate that decolonizing education cannot stop at curriculum. It will need to extend to the infrastructures of research, funding, and measurement, and more. What I really appreciated the most about the contributions included in this book was that they not only criticize or demonstrate, but create, build, and change. So there was a significant emphasis throughout the book that the work of transformation must be rooted in reparative imagination, collective action, and particularly epistemic humility. Humility is a necessary condition for open and meaningful dialogue. And in international education and development, I would say this humility can be transformative. Epistemic humility, borrowing the concept from the book, invites us to move away from extractive models of expertise towards mutual and relational forms of knowledge and meaning making. So to me, the book seems to emphasize that decolonizing knowledge is not to simply replace one dominant approach or one existing approach with another. Instead, it is to engage in continuous dialogue, to listen and to recognize the plurality. So with these important points addressed in the book, I want all of us to continuously think about how. How can we move from critic to transformation in our own institutions and organizations, where many of these colonial logics identified in the book persist, right? And how can we ensure that this rethinking that we have explored today does not remain at the level of discourse, so that it's not just the talk, but actually they get translated into restructured funding, pedagogy, and policy. So these questions are indeed closely related to the points brought up in the Q&A session today. By reading the questions shared in the Q&A box, I could tell that this is something that we all are interested in investigating, learning more. There are challenges associated with what transformation actually entails across different education and policy contexts, and how to make the transformation actually happen. So in addition to the approaches and examples shared in the book and also in the session today, I think what this book brings us is the call to reimagine development education as something grounded in solidarity, interdependence, and historical accountability. So it reminds us that no transformation is possible without first acknowledging the harms of the past and now, and reimagining futures that are truly inclusive, plural, and just. It is also very essential to recognize that this is not solely individual work, but ultimately a collective endeavor. The tough question is, remaining challenges, there is no single solution or golden key to transformation. And indeed, that is precisely what this book would caution against. I think true transformation would resist easy answers because it requires ongoing reflection, ongoing humility, and responsiveness to local needs and histories. And they differ significantly across the context that we are situated in. So the book invites us to stay with this complexity. With those points, I would like to remind everyone that all participants will receive a follow-up email with the event video recordings, event highlights, and the link to the publication. Also, we have a few upcoming events. One at the annual meeting of Comparative and International Education Society in Chicago. You can use this QR code shared on the screen now to check out the list of sessions from NORRAG members. So if you would also like to feature your session, please send us an email and we'll be happy to also include that in the list. Also, we have the 5th session of the UNESCO Cherry series in comparative education policy, and also the official launch events of NSI 11 on multilingualism and language transition. You can use these QR codes, once again, shared in the screen to register and also access the publication in the case of NSI 11 already. So with that, once again, I'd like to thank the editor, the authors, and all the participants who attended the event today. Please use this QR code to read and download the contributions. You have the full access. And I also want to thank all of you once again who joined us today for engaging in today's conversation. Thank you so much. Right back to you, Hugh.
Thank you very much, Chan Wong, and thank you all. At a time where we've taken moments out from reality to think about reality, and are reminded that the reality we live in is perhaps a lot more challenging and a lot more terrible than we thought, but also so many wonderful colleagues, so much to do, so much to build. So thank you, all of you, for being here, for your commitment to the Global South, to developing our field, and to the life and work we need to contribute to bring about the changes that we dare to reimagine in this book. So thank you very much, everyone, and all the best.